7 o'clock. Glad you're here. Time to start. Appreciate everybody's presence tonight. Beautiful day we had today, and every day's good. We'll begin with a word of prayer tonight, and Stephen Peavy, would you open us with a prayer, please? Amen. Tonight we're going to be in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. We're going to look at Paul's thorn in the flesh and see what that may be. We're not given the exact answer, but there's a couple of things, thoughts about it, what it could be. 2 Corinthians 12, verse 7 through 10 is where we find it. Unless I shall be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing I pleaded with the Lord 3 times, that it might depart from me. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore most gladly I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, and distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So we know he had something. He called it a thorn in the flesh. Some think it could be a health condition, and it could be. Some think that it's an individual that was hindering him, and that could be. Either one of them can hinder a person from doing what he wants to do. Health problems, we're all know what, if we lose our health for a period of time, how it can slow us down, how it can cause us to step back and, regroup and get better and then begin again. And we know how maybe an individual can hinder our work, whether it be at work or it be, a neighbor that's sort of grumpy or whatever. Or sometimes in the work of the Lord, there can be individuals that can hinder our work even there. But this is something that was constantly hindering Paul, and it was having an effect on his work in the Lord. Now, of course, he had his enemies, where he went from place to place. He had those that caused trouble. And whatever this was, one thing that it did, it kept Paul humble. It kept him from thinking more highly of himself than he should. And one might think, well, you would think Paul would do that? Well, he's human. He's human just like all of us are. And it may be sometimes that we begin to think a little more of ourselves than we should. And God has ways in which he can humble us. And we may look back on some things and we might see God's working there, how he may have had a hand in it. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But there are things that certainly can cause us to think more highly of ourselves than we should. And the reason he gives this humbling is there in verse 7, the abundance of revelations. Paul received a lot of instructions from God, a lot of them. And therefore, it's a possibility that he could be thinking, well, look how special I am. God is talking to me more than he is the other apostles. I'm out here doing a lot of great work, doing a lot of great things, and I'm by far traveling more than these other apostles. And it could get to a person thinking. And that's what he says there. The abundance of revelations. So we don't always think of Paul being that way, but it could be. And he wrote most of the books of the New Testament, 13 letters he wrote. So he had a lot. And think of what we would be missing if we didn't have Paul's letters. We have 13 less books. So he did a lot of writing, he did a lot of traveling, and this may very well be the way that God chose to keep him humble because of his duties of being an apostle. Now we see this, that applies even to us in Romans 12 and verse 3. Paul here says, "For I say, through the grace given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dwelt to each one a measure of faith." Then Galatians 6:3, he says, "For if anyone thinks of himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself." So there's two warnings that Paul gives. Don't think more highly of yourself than you should. And when you think you're something, be careful, because you could be nothing. Be careful of that thinking. In Philippians 2 and verse 3, "Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself." Be thinking about others, helping them. Galatians 5:26, "Let us not be conceited, provoking one another, envying one another." Well, we've all probably been around some people who had a little conceit about them. Thought a little more of themselves than they should. Paul says don't do that. And then Christ says in Matthew 23:12, "Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted." Live a humble life and God will lift you up. Live a humble life and God will exalt you. If you want to go the other way, if you want to exalt yourself, you will be humbled. Now, God may have a part in it. It may be just something that goes along with the territory, but humility can happen. We can sort of think more of ourselves than we should, and then there's that embarrassing situation we find ourselves in, and, well, it sort of brings us back down. So it can happen different ways. God can be involved, or just a part of the humbling process. It can happen. But Paul certainly had humility. We don't need to think of him as of one that had this conceited look about him all the time. Look at me, an apostle, a great man that I am. He certainly didn't have that. Here's how he spoke of himself in 1 Corinthians 15:9. "For I am the least of the apostles, who am not worthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God." He's the least of the apostles. That's how he looked at himself. He came in a little bit late. He persecuted the church. None of the other apostles did that. None of them persecuted any church members, or threatened them, or killed them. But he did. He put himself least. And even Ephesians 3:8, among Christians, he says, "To me, who am less than the least of all saints, this grace was given that I should preach among the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ." So he looked at himself as being the least of all the saints, the least. So he had a humility about him. He had the right humility. But still, he had to be on guard about this the revelations that were coming to him. Be on guard against those. So that's why he had this thorn. Whatever it was, that's why he had it, to keep him humble. Now back to 2 Corinthians 12:7. The word there, thorn, unless I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn. When you think of a thorn, you probably think of a rose bush. They have thorns. Or you think of go out and pick blackberries. and sometimes you get thorns all over you from picking. That is a possible meaning of the word here. But how many let a little thorn stop them? Something that small. We don't let a little thorn stop us. We pull it out. Get a needle, dig it out if we have to. That doesn't stop us. But the thorn can also mean, that word can also mean in the scriptures, a torture device, a stake. You take a stick and sharpen the end of it. Now, you get stabbed with that. That's going to slow you down. You let somebody hit you in the side with that, and it penetrates your intestines or whatever, that's going to slow you down. So this thorn is not a little something small. It's something large. And they would also use this thorn, and we might have seen them before, that they would dig a pit, and they put these stakes in these holes and cover it, hoping that the enemy will step on them and go through, and it would pierce their foot. Well, that would stop somebody. And that's what this thorn here means. It's pretty deadly, whatever it was. It was something that was designed, if nothing else, to slow him down, maybe even stop him from going about and doing the work he was needing to do. We see there in verse 7 as well, it talks about a messenger. That's why I think it's somebody. And it's not some health issue. I think it's somebody. A messenger of Satan to buffet me. Paul had a lot of enemies. A lot of enemies. Enemies who tried to kill him on different occasions. At times he had to flee for his life, escape. They let him down the wall at one point so he could get away from the enemy. And he talks about his enemies many times in the scriptures. When he went from place to place on these missionary journeys, he had people who would follow him. He would stop in a place and they would follow and they would try to disrupt him, try to just stop his work from taking place. So it could be one person, a messenger. It could be a group of people, a gang we might think of that were trying to stop him. But I think his thorn was a messenger from Satan, of Satan. And that individual was there to try to stop him. That kept Paul humbled as well. Realize he's always got to look out. Be on his guard against these individuals or this individual for what they would try to do to him. Here's what he said in Acts 9:23. Now, after many days were passed, the Jews plotted to kill him. They wanted to kill him. And he was told about this, and he had to escape. Acts 23:12. When it was day, some of the Jews band together and bound themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. That's a pretty good oath. We're not going to eat or drink till we kill him. Well, apparently they died of dehydration, or they died of hunger. They didn't kill him. But anyway, that's making a pretty good oath there of what they would do to him if they ever caught up with him. And he talks of different times in 2 Corinthians 11:26. In journeys often, in perils of water, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren. All these are times when his life was at risk. There's an opportunity there, a chance there that he would lose his life. And don't think just one or two times. But there was a lot in his life of which the enemy or the messenger of Satan was after him. Now, Paul talks about an individual. In 2 Timothy 4:14 and 15, Alexander the coppersmith. He said, Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm. May the Lord repay him according to his works. You also must be aware of him, for he has greatly resisted our words. And if you back up to 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 20, there's another one there mentioned Alexander. We don't know if this is the same one. Very possible it is, that because he's writing to Timothy, and he would be familiar with Alexander. But he says, of whom Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I delivered to Satan, that they might learn not to blaspheme. So they were doing some harm to the work of Paul and causing him harm. They did me much harm. And God says the Lord's going to take care of them, of him anyway, of Alexander. Take care of him. There are other times in the Scriptures where there's a man mentioned by the name of Alexander. One's in Acts 19:33, but most don't think that that's this one, because the one in Acts is helping Paul. It's helping Paul in his work. It could be that Alexander went the bad way, I don't know, but I'm sure there was more than one individual named Alexander. But verse 14, he calls him out by his name and by his occupation and what he was doing. A lot of harm. And if we look back in the Old Testament, the word thorn, it's the equivalent of what we find in the New Testament. And it means an enemy. In Numbers 33:55, but if you do not drive out the inhabitants from the land from before you, then it shall be that those whom you let remain shall be irritants to your eyes and thorns in your side, that they shall harass you in the land where you dwell. So you see the word thorn used in the Scriptures again in the Old Testament. It means an enemy. An enemy. And there's other verses where it's used there in Joshua, Ezekiel, and Micah concerning that. So even in the Old, the word thorn had a meaning about what it would be. Well, that's the thought on an individual. That was his thorn in the flesh, that messenger. And I believe it was somebody. I believe it was several somebodies that were after him, trying to stop him. But on the other hand, you have those who think maybe it was something fleshly, something health reason that was wrong with him. And they got scriptures on this, and it very well could be. And I can see where it could be to some degree. Like Galatians 4:13 through 15 is where we pick up that it could be something health-wise. It says, you know that because of physical infirmity, I preached the gospel to you at the first. And my trial, which was in my flesh, you did not despise or reject, but you received me as an angel of God, even as Christ Jesus. What then was the blessing you enjoyed? For I bear you witness that, if possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me. So Paul had some kind of fleshly problem, some kind of health problem about him. Some think that maybe it was his eyes because of what he says in verse 15. I don't know if it was his eyes or not that had a problem. He had a problem seeing maybe. Maybe he was nearsighted or farsighted, or who knows what it could be. But he may have been just meaning eyes. That eyes would be our most precious, I think, part of our body. I had a lot rather give up my hearing than I had my eyes. That's eyesight. I'd rather give up a hand or an arm than I had my eyesight. Some think it means that they would give the most precious item if it could help him to overcome this health issue that he had. And to back that up, they go to Galatians 6 and verse 11, where Paul says, "See with what large letters I have written to you with my own hand." Maybe the large letters, he could see better. I didn't put the verses down. I didn't look them up. But Paul had, at times, he had individuals that he would dictate to, and they would write out the letter. He had that. So that could be a possibility there again. He couldn't see very well. Again, eye problem, large letters, had somebody to write it for him. So that could be a possibility there. But if we had gone through what Paul had gone through, how would our bodies look? How would our eyesight be? How many teeth would we have lost due to being beaten, or scars, or broken bones, or limping? How would we do if we went through what Paul went through? A little bit. He tells us a little bit in 2 Corinthians 11:23. And they are ministers. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more. In labors more abundant. In stripes above measure. In prisons more frequently. In deaths often. From the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have been in the deep. If we went through this, how would our bodies look? Beaten. Stripes, a kid didn't count them. Again, 5 times he was beaten by the Romans, you might say, 40 stripes minus 1, with rods. He was stoned, left for dead. They thought he was dead. He may have been dead, and the Lord may have raised him. But anybody want to compare your complaints, what you're going through, to what Paul was going through? For Christ? What's some of the difficulties you had being a Christian? I don't think we need to compare him to Paul. I don't think so. He's went through a whole lot. He continues this in verse 26, 2 Corinthians 11:26. In journeys often, in perils of water, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of the Gentiles, perils of the city, perils of the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and toil, in sleeplessness often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. Besides the other things, what comes among me daily, my deep concern for all the churches. So he goes through the list even more. And he says, there's other things. I'm just not going to write about them. He went through a lot. His own brethren hated him. False teachers hated him. He lost sleep. He was hungry. He was thirsty. Had to fast quite a bit. Probably not by choice. Cold. Naked. Did he have any broken bones? Any scars? Did his eyes ever get busted up by somebody's fist or rocks or a stick or whatever? He had it pretty rough. What did his back look like? You can see his back. So he may have had some health problems after he went through all this. Any of us probably would if we went through this. And in 2 Corinthians 10:10, here's what some say about it. Here's the verse. For by his letters, they say, are weighty and powerful, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech contemptible. They're saying you had a lot rather read his letters than be in person and hear him speak, is what they're saying. And they may be saying right here, he was just an ugly man. He was an ugly man. His speech, contemptible. You ever been around somebody that their speech just, it goes right through you? You say, boy, I hate to have to listen to that every night. Sometimes we come across people that are like that. And their voice, and they can't help it. It's just the vocal cords that they have. And some think that maybe that was what he was thinking about, his thorn in the flesh. I'm just an ugly man and I have a terrible voice. I don't think so, but it could be. There's a book called The Acts of Paul and Thalicia. That was written in 160 AD. It's not inspired. It's just telling history of the time. And it talks about Paul. And it described Paul as a little man of stature, thin hair, crooked in his legs, and a hooked nose. That's how they described him. Little man, little in stature, thin hair, crooked leg. I guess he was bow-legged. I don't know. It had a hooked nose. That's how the book described him. I don't know if it's anything to it or not, but 160 AD, some things could have been passed on about him from those that actually were with him, and they passed it on, but that's how they described him. Now, here's some things that people think that also could be his thorn in the flesh. He may have had the temptation to just quit, or sexual temptations. Either his wife had died or he had never married. Sorrow over the unconverted. At one verse, he said, I would give up my own salvation if it meant my brethren would be converted, talking about the Jews. Sorrow over past persecutions of Christians. Oh, he had that with him all the time. Some think he had a temper. Some think it was malaria, had eyesight problems, or epilepsy. And all these, they'll find a verse that matches it. And that's where they go with it. It's not they just making these up. They'll find a verse, and this verse may mention something about some of this, or it may be one word that gives them away. You know, who wrote the book of Acts? Luke. What was Luke's job? He was a doctor. Some of the words Luke would use would be medical words, and that's where they may find the malaria or eyesight or epilepsy. Some of the words that Luke used, that's where they may come across with some of these possible thorns in the flesh. We go back to 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 8. Concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, and persecutions, and distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. He did ask God for it to be removed. If it was somebody, or if it was a health issue, but God said no. He said, I'll take care of you. You need this, Paul, to keep you humble. You need this to not be thinking more of yourself than you should. And Paul accepted it. And God sustained him through it. It made him a better person, made him a better Christian, more faithful Christian. And I think we may all have a thorn in the flesh somewhat. Whatever it may be that keeps us from being as active as we should as Christians, or keeps us from growing as we should, or keeps us from being as more faithful than we can be, and we know what that thorn may be. And that thorn is something maybe we got to deal with and overcome it to be the faithful Christian, the best that we can be when it comes to serving our Lord. Sometimes we got to think outside the box or get outside the box, do some things that maybe we're not comfortable with. I'm talking about good spiritual things, doing those things and growing from it. So there's the thorn in the flesh. One or two things it could be. But I lean more toward a messenger, somebody that was against him. Any comment or anything on the Paul's thorn? Yeah, maybe a bunch of thorns. It says thorns. It didn't say thorns or thorn. Thorn, pip. It could be a plural word. Yeah. Yep. But he didn't let it stop him. Okay. We'll conclude here. About time for the bell.